So as we wait for another couple students to come, and then we'll do an activity, this will give us a little bit of a reminder on purpose as well, as that'll be our discussion today. So again, let me know if there's anything wrong with the audio, you can't hear me or anything like that. So these are two examples that kind of show opposite trajectories of going from purpose to heroism, or heroism and finding purpose in that. So let's talk first about Oscar Romero. And so he's a really good example of purpose leading to heroism. So looking at his life story and the experiences that he had in life, very early on, he thought he would go into the seminary. He thought he would become a Catholic priest. And so that was an early goal for him. And so over time, it became a purpose to his life. It was really important to do that, to share these spiritual messages with people, to help people. So this is a quote. I won't read the whole thing, but it really shows, especially this phrase, the nucleus of my life. He's really talking there about his purpose and how he felt a purpose to do this work. So with that, a lot of his actions were very purpose driven. He was very active in doing church work and helping people. And over time, with working with people, he realized the plight of the working poor in San Salvador. And he felt a lot of empathy for those people. And he was very opposed to the government supporting the wealthy landowners. So there was basically systems set up that kept the working poor poor. So with that being said, he didn't do much activism at this time. He was kind of in his own lane, like within that church setting, giving sermons, things like that, doing church work, not really extending much beyond that. One of his mentors was actually assassinated because of their activism. So with that, that became a turning point for Romero, realizing, oh my goodness, look at the systems that exist. I've now killed my mentor, kind of a father figure to him. And so with that, he kind of took on that mantle and became an outspoken opponent of injustice and a defender of the poor. So risking his own life, risking his own health to speak out against the systems that existed. So that purpose that he had to help people, that training that he had over time, his faith as well, helped drive that purpose and help lead him to doing these heroic acts. So this is one way that purpose can actually lead people to act heroically. Your purpose has to be something meaningful to yourself. It gives you goals, both short and long term. And we see that throughout Romero's life. He had goals to like graduate and get specific degrees and have specific mentorships and work in specific places. So we can see those short and long term goals throughout his life. But it also has to be beyond yourself. So a purpose is different from meaning in that it is beyond yourself. And so for Romero, it was the people around him that he was working for, as well as his faith and his deity was also what he was working for. So that's obviously beyond yourself. So those actions and that purpose led him to then act heroically in a situation that called for it. So not everybody who has a purpose will necessarily be heroic. A lot of people who might act heroically at some point in their life never face an opportunity where they will need to act heroically. So you might have all your first aid training, you might have great swimming ability, but if you never come across someone, say, drowning in a river, like a fast-moving river, you're not going to necessarily use that training. So same kind of thing here. So Romero ended up being in a position where he was able to use those skills that he'd built over that lifespan, and that purpose drove him then to this heroic action. So Romero also was assassinated for his work in support of the poor. It wasn't until recently. I don't know if I have that on one of these slides. No, I don't. Essentially, the government, the current modern government of San Salvador, essentially apologized and admitted their role in that assassination, and he was named a hero years after what he did, even by the people that he was, well, the government that now exists as it's evolved from what he did. So a really good example of having a purpose early on in life, having commitment to that, doing things, those short and long-term goals, doing things for others around him, and that the position that he found himself in facilitated his ability to act heroically. So that's one path that purpose can take to lead to heroism, but there's another opposite path where you can start with heroism just immediately, and that through that you can find your purpose. So Miep Gies is a really good example of that. She was actually part of the family that hid the Frank family during World War II. So she was fairly young, 23. She had a job under the Franks, and she opposed Hitler, but she wasn't really politically engaged. If you look at her journals and her own writings and her interviews, she didn't really feel strongly about things one way or another. She wasn't really doing things outside herself. So while there were things that were meaningful to her, she didn't have that beyond the self component of purpose. So interestingly, you may not have known this, the Frank family actually asked Miep Gies to hide them. So it wasn't like her coming to offer, they asked for help. And it's an interesting aspect of prosocial behavior that's not studied as much in the US and Western cultures, but a lot of other cultures see asking for help and then someone giving that help as even more prosocial than we tend to in the US. This might be too much of a tangent, but we tend to see prosocial behavior that people do. So like if I just go and shovel someone's walkway or something, I mean, there's no snow today, that was last week. So if I went and shoveled someone's snow, a lot of people in the US see that as more prosocial, doing that anonymously, and on my own accord. In other cultures, people see it more prosocial to do something good for someone after they've asked. So they asked for a favor. She did this favor. She put herself at risk to hide the Frank family. She understood the risks and consciously made that decision. She knew what she was getting into at that time. So with that, seeing what it did for them, seeing what it was doing for other families who were being hidden, seeing what was happening in the system around her, helped her start to develop a purpose to help more people. And so even after the Franks, she continued to take steps to help Jewish people over time. And so essentially you can look at her writings and her interviews and see that over time, while she was doing these heroic actions, putting her own life at risk to help other people, that she was developing a purpose in that sphere. So really, really great example of doing something heroic and then developing a purpose out of that heroism, versus Romero had those clear signs of purpose, and that clear purpose led to heroic action. Again, both these individuals, if they were in different situations, they might never have had a chance to act heroically. So that's a unique aspect of heroism, is that anybody who might be prepared to be heroic, or an intended hero, or a hero in waiting, there's a couple different terms that people are using. If they never come across a situation where they need to act heroically, then you might not know that that person would be heroic. So just one aspect of the research there. So questions about either of them or this general idea of purpose, those are the main points, is the purpose itself. So that beyond the self-concerns, that give you goals and that you find it meaningful. So it was meaningful to help other people, to rescue them. There were goals set for that. So had to get people food, had to move them from place to place, things like that, long-term and short-term goals. So really clear purposes there. So hopefully purpose is a lot more clear. We've got a lot more students now, so there's more I could say about it, but I think that's good for the class. Let's talk for a minute. Let's go back to this small group discussion. I asked you to think about this in the meantime before last class, or at the end of last class. So let's get into small groups. Basically, we can use the groups that are already set in teams. So here, as a reminder, this is how to find those groups. So if your last name starts with A through E, jump into this group. If your last name starts with F through L, jump into this group. If your last name starts with M through P, jump in this group. And Q through Z, jump in this group. So hopefully that divides us pretty evenly amongst those groups. So in a minute, go and do that. You can keep this general meeting open in the background. So you can like flip back and see the instructions if you want. Um, but basically start your own meeting. Whoever gets there first, just start a video chat. To do that, you would basically just go here, and then I'm not going to do it, but click the meet button. Or if someone says, hey, I'm here, you can also reply and click this to start a meeting as well. So I just recommend going to this page, click meet if you're the first one there in your group. And the things that we'll be talking about, hopefully you could see that. I think it shows as I'm sharing my screen there. Yeah, I am sharing. So get into those groups, and then we will talk about these questions. How might purpose or meaning, so it can be purposeful, like beyond the self-concern, so doing things for other people, or it can be things that are just meaningful to you. So purpose or meaning, how might that look different in middle adults versus adolescents or early adults? Are there going to be types of purposes or things that are meaningful that stay consistent from adolescence to early adulthood to middle adulthood? Are there going to be some dramatic differences? So talk about both those things. So, and with that, after you figure out a couple ideas of things that might be purposeful or meaningful across those time spans, and some things that might be different, also talk about what challenges you think it might be for people who don't engage in meaningful activities. What challenges might they face in middle adulthood? And that'll transition really well into our discussion of generativity with chapter 14. So let's talk about this for about 10 minutes or so. I'll jump through the groups and we'll probably come back here at 8:55. And I'll let you know if we're going to come back later. So jump into those small groups, and then at 8:55 we'll jump back into this room. All right, it looks like most everyone is back in this room, so great job. I was able to jump through and listen to a bunch of discussions. It was interesting to hear such similar things being said across the groups, and the connections that you were making to different things. So one thing that I heard that's really interesting, since it's one of the next things we'll talk about, is that for those people who don't engage in meaningful activities, maybe they have a harder time, they have some challenges. Also, I heard comments and discussions about midlife crises and how what we might look at as a midlife crisis might not actually fit an actual crisis. So really good connections made there. Are there any questions that came up? Um, the questions that I heard people debating, it sounded like they got covered, but are there any questions that you want to bring in front of the class and myself to get answered or clarified on any of these points? All right, well, yeah, really good discussions. So purpose and meaning in a lot of ways might look the same across these time spans. It depends what things are meaningful to you, right? So with that being said, there are, like we talked about last time, a lot of positive correlations with some really good things like well-being and pro-social behavior and meaning in life. Well, meaning is a little tautological because that's up there. But there's a lot of good benefits for having things that are meaningful to yourself or things that are purposeful. When things are purposeful, where the big difference there is that you're doing things beyond yourself. So some examples that we had just a minute ago were helping other people. We had purpose also to a deity. Other things can be purposeful to you too as well. I heard some debate on like, would this be purposeful or not? So things like activism, oftentimes people find meaning in being activists for various causes that can also be purposeful. So if it's working to improve the world beyond yourself, whatever it is that you're fighting for could be purposeful. So another example of purpose is a lot of people find purpose in their work or meaning in their work, though not everybody. So there's a lot of different avenues to find this, and you can have purpose. You can have multiple purposes or multiple things that you find meaning in. So yeah, it's definitely not limited. And hopefully more people are finding things that are meaningful and purposeful. Yeah, the stats with the scales that we have suggest not as many as we might hope, like less than 50%, maybe have a clear sense of purpose in life, even if they have things that are meaningful to them. So hopefully that might be a problem with our measures that we're using and not being clear about what is actually purposeful or not doing a good job like grasping that. Also, people can change their purposes and still look for it in different ways too. So similar to identity, that can change over time. All right. So, as an example, in adolescence, your family might be really meaningful or purposeful to you, but your role in a family is going to be different when you're an adolescent versus maybe you're an early adult, and maybe you have a partner or maybe a young family, and then a middle adult. Maybe at that point you have a young family towards late middle adulthood. Maybe you have older children. Maybe you even have grandchildren. So those different time periods might change the way you view your purpose, even though you find purpose in your family. So things can shift, but still be consistent in some ways too. All right, so good discussions there. Let's jump to chapter 14. And so chapter 14 is more about the socio-emotional development in middle adulthood. And a lot of things that we've touched on already really tie into this strongly. So we've talked about cognitive changes, physical changes, and we've already talked a lot about aspects of socio-emotional development. So some of this might be a little repetitious, or you might just see a little more descriptions of certain things. So first, let's talk about stages of adulthood and some important aspects or some different theories that have happened through the course of lifespan development about what's happening at this stage of life. So we've mentioned generativity quite a few times. Here is our definition, that it's a desire to leave legacies for the next generation. So Erikson always was talking about like two opposing crises. You had either generativity or stagnation. right? You had identity or you didn't, right? So this is another one of those critical times for Erikson. As it turns out, it isn't as critical, or it's not as big of a crisis. This goes into the midlife crisis as well. But a lot of middle adults are concerned about what they're leaving for people. There's a couple ways generativity commonly displays, and it can display in multiple of these or none of these as well. Generativity can be displayed in a lot of ways, but these are some of the well, stagnation is just not being generative. You don't feel like you are being generative. So these are the couple ways that generativity tends to display. So biological, having children, having grandchildren, people feel they have given to the world or passed themselves on or given a legacy through their offspring, like literal genetic offspring. Also, there's parental generativity, and this is a little different, although it might sound similar. So this is nurturing and guiding a child. Or this child doesn't even have to be your own. It could be just someone you're mentoring. It could be adopted child. Yeah, it doesn't even have to be someone. It could be a peer that is maybe even just a little bit younger than you that you feel you're helping to guide, and you're getting that parental generativity there. So the biological is like I'm passing on my genetics. Parental is I'm nurturing and guiding and helping that next generation. So those can be related to each other. They don't have to be, though. So work generativity, you're passing your skills and expertise on. So if you've developed such and such skills, one example is one of my research methods teachers. It appears, I've never actually talked to them about this. Maybe I should ask them before using this as an example in class. They probably wouldn't care though, but I'll ask the next time I think about it. Seems to get a lot of satisfaction with passing on expertise that they have in scale development. So it's a specific skill that they've built and honed over decades. They're really good at it, and they know a lot of nuances, and they like to pass on those little tips and tricks, and it makes them very happy to do that. So that's one example of that. In that kind of teacher-student role, they're able to do that. But you can do that as like a mentor or an apprentice. So if you've been working on cars for 3 decades, there's probably a lot that you know. There's actually a couple of YouTubers that I watch who that's what they've been doing. They've worked on cars for 40 or 50 years, and now they put up jobs on a YouTube channel to say like tips and tricks for repairing cars. So those are good ones to watch because they usually know what they're talking about. Another aspect of generativity is cultural generativity. So leaving aspects of your culture. So whether you're sharing that, and again, this can be related to the parental or work generativity. So aspects of your culture, passing that on to children or other people to continue on with that culture. So these are some of the most common aspects of generativity, but as I talk about these and these examples, it might make you think of other people in your life who might be showing generativity. And you can do this even earlier on in life, but this is a common concern for people in middle adulthood. You can also do this later on in life too. If you are doing these things in middle adulthood and later on, you will tend to have higher well-being, probably be more involved with people and groups, and that can be really, really beneficial. So what would you maybe say to, let's say, a middle-aged woman who has never had children of her own and fears she has lost that opportunity to leave a legacy? What are other things you might suggest to this person? Other ways that they might already be being generative that they're maybe not considering, or maybe things that they could do to be generative. So feel free to either take over the mic or also put it in the meeting chat. So adopting, and then you could probably get that parental generativity because it seems like that's what they're concerned with. Yeah, so adopting could be one way to do that. Another comment here, volunteering or mentoring could be another good way to do that. And you could also, even if it's not an adopted child, you could still get some of that parental generativity and maybe even cultural generativity or work generativity by volunteering or mentoring as well. So if you're working with people for a cause, helping mentor someone in that cause as well, great ways. All right, another comment here. Contributions to society. So probably here again talking about like volunteering, doing things for the world. So perhaps with own family, caring for an elderly family member. So that would definitely be considered a pro-social. Caring for an elderly family member would definitely be like a meaningful, probably purposeful thing. I wonder if it would fit the definition, the technical definition of generativity, because you're usually leaving something behind with it. And so this is where like definitions of things like caring for an elderly family member is obviously good and meaningful. You're going to get a lot of these positive benefits that you would get also from volunteering and mentoring. But I'm not sure it would actually be generativity based on the definition. So that's why we have these different constructs. Sometimes they're overlapping. Generativity, for example, is actually really overlapping with civic engagement. So civic engagement, like working in your community, there's a lot of overlap with generativity there. And I think that's what we would get for caring for an elderly family member. But it's still really great. Definitely good thing to do. So good comments here. Reframing the way that this person's looking at their own life. So yeah, showing them that there probably are areas this person is contributing already to the world, to family members, to people. Yeah. But yeah, those are some really good ideas. So there's a lot of ways you can be generative and leaving something for the following generations. So something like caring for an elderly family member, that is definitely civic engagement for sure. So with that, generativity itself is highly correlated, and civic engagement as well is correlated with higher well-being. So feeling happier about your life, feeling more eudaimonic and hedonic well-being, positive social engagement with family, friends, and communities. So basically, if you're engaged and involved with something, you're going to probably be doing that with other people. So that is really helpful for social interactions, for socio-emotional health, better health overall, wisdom as well. So you feel like you're more wise as well when you're able to share and pass on ideas and changes. So yeah, really good comments there. Some really good things. And hopefully you consider this throughout your life as well, that whether you're disappointed that you're not able to, say, do the thing in your career that you want, or you're not passing on things in your career or with your family, there's probably other areas of your life that you can look at and see, oh, well, I'm doing a lot of positive things in this area. So that can be really helpful to boost that well-being and see that you are being effective at doing good. All right, so hopefully we've got a clear understanding of generativity. One of the initial studies on middle adulthood was this one, the Seasons of a Man's Life study. In the N basically means, I think we've mentioned this before, it's basically the number of people in a study. So middle-aged men, based on the year, is probably mostly white men, age 40. Middle-aged men, 40 people. That's not a huge sample. So I'm pointing out this one to kind of show like what later studies have shown and kind of show you the transition and things that we've learned over time in the sphere of research. So interviewing these individuals, I mean, with doing interviews, it is hard to get really big samples because if you're interviewing someone for 2 hours, you've got 40 interviews, that is a long time. So it's different than, say, doing a survey. You could do a survey for 400 people really quickly. Doing interviews with 400 people is going to take a lot longer. So qualitative versus quantitative research, you should expect different numbers of people, but 40 is still not a lot to make some really broad sweeping claims. So some of the conflicts seen in these interviews was being old versus being young. So like feeling younger than your actual age, being destructive versus being constructive. You might call that generativity now. Masculine versus feminine, attached to others versus separate from them. So probably a little bit there of socio-emotional relationships, probably a little bit generativity, identity as well. And then success depends on how effectively a person combines both sides of the continuum in their own life. So these were some of the things that Levinson saw and were some of the initial pieces of research into middle adulthood. So we've come a long way in how many years is that? I can't do math in my head very quickly. 50, 60 years or so. So later on, research did a better job at getting bigger samples, more diverse samples. So with that, we kind of see some different transitions. And I've alluded to this at a couple different times, that maybe we should break up middle adulthood into more ages. So these are actually pictures from your textbook, I believe, that I just put straight into here. And they talk about it well. So you've got your middle adulthood, probably transitioning that 33 to 40. The transition before that is going from early adulthood into that middle adulthood, and then entering into early adulthood before that. I should probably reorder though. That's a little confusing, having the different ages there. So let's start at earlier on. So a life structure for middle adulthood. So things are a little more solid. You can see a lot of similarities between like 40 and 50-year-olds. Then from 50 to 55, still pretty stable, not a lot of change there. They've kind of entered into that stable place, then they're pretty stable. And then after that point, there might be more changes. So more health changes we've talked about, as well as some more socio-emotional changes. Parents, for example, might be moving back in, or parents dying, children leaving the home, those kinds of things. So life structure is changing there. And then 60 and beyond, earlier research didn't take as much of a look at this, but more recent research has. And so just goes to show like kind of the steps we've taken as a field in researching these times of the life. But let's jump to midlife crises. I think this is a good thing to talk about, since I heard it from, I think, all the groups about midlife crises. So midlife crises are not really very pervasive, and that's what a lot of you have read the chapter and we're talking about. So essentially, the 40s are decades of reassessing, reordering truth, thinking about your early adult years, your adolescence years, combining those. So doing that job of developing your identity still. So you're still doing those things. So only a very small minority of middle adults experience a midlife crisis. With that being said, there are people who do. And even when they do, it doesn't tend to be as severe or extreme or a big change in that person as you might see in like media or things like that. So with this, from early adulthood through late adulthood, most people's happiness and well-being kind of continually increases over time. Like obviously there's different things that might make your overall well-being decrease, so you get really ill or something like that. There's a giant pandemic or something like that. That can definitely drop that down. But a general average trend for most people is a continual upward tick. And this isn't like a huge like exponential tick, but it's like generally slowly upward. So that's really good. And that also suggests that people tend to be pretty happy overall, have a pretty high sense of well-being. So if they're doing things like buying a new car or buying a new truck, it might not be that they're having this crisis, even though from an outside perspective, it seems that that might be a strange behavior. At this time, maybe they have more disposable income, just that one specific example. And maybe it's something that they did want and now they can get, that kind of thing, rather than them changing their entire lifestyle and having an actual crisis of identity. So identity changes over time. Different aspects of identity might be more clear or salient at different times in life. These changes are pretty normal. There's a lot more change than we might have originally thought 60 years ago in doing research. So here's a really good video on midlife crises and identity development in middle adulthood. So let's watch this person's experience. We're going to watch it at a little faster speed. So let me know if it's too fast and I can slow it down. Yeah, if you can't understand, let me know. I will slow it down.
I'm a brand strategist and a designer. I'm also a white guy in his 40s with receding salt and pepper hair who drives a fast car. The very first time that I ever felt the painful grip of midlife crisis was in 1984. I was 13, sitting in my room, listening to a Doors record, and it dawned on me that Jim Morrison, one of my heroes, had died at age 27. In fact, a lot of my artist heroes had died at 27. This was not good because I was 13 and a half, and I realized that if I were to only live to 27, I was already halfway there. For a couple of weeks, this put me into a real slump. My next midlife crisis came when I was a couple years out of college. I guess I was halfway to 50 at this point, which, by the way, is an age at which a lot of other heroes had died young. But 50 is not what bothered me at this time. It was 35, because that was only 10 years away, and I knew that once I hit 35, I was over the hill. So that put me into a funk again for a short time. My next midlife crisis, though, came at 40 and a half. I had successfully crossed the threshold of 40 with very little drama or chaos. I was proud of this. But then, one beautiful December morning, my dad died. Suddenly and unexpectedly. There's my dad. 66 and in great health, and then he was just gone. And that was so tough, because now one of my greatest heroes, if not my greatest hero, was gone, but also I was for the first time really looking death in the face and seeing it stare right back at me. Okay, so if you're thinking to yourself, this guy sounds a little confused about what a midlife crisis is, you're right, but so are you, because midlife crisis doesn't mean what you think it means. By definition, a midlife crisis is a dip in a person's satisfaction with their life and in their self-confidence. This dip happens about halfway through our life expectancy. That is not what the term midlife crisis has come to mean in our contemporary culture. Most of the time that term is used, we're talking about someone, a person who's engaged in irresponsible, immature, sometimes even destructive behavior. Example: I can't believe your husband's leaving you for a 25-year-old yoga instructor. How does that happen? Well, clearly he's going through a midlife crisis, right? Now, to a brand strategist like me, when there is such a disconnect between what something is and what something is perceived as, that is a branding problem. And it's a problem worth trying to solve. Now, most of the people that I've worked with on brand...
I do want to point out here, you can see this person thinking about this definitional issue from the point of view of their expertise. So they're a branding strategist. That's the perspective they're coming at this from. This happens probably to you. This happens to me. When you see a problem, it's filtered through your own expertise, your own experience. So I think a really good example also of how expertise might influence just other aspects of your life that you're not necessarily aware of. So a little bit of a tangent, but relevant to expertise that we were talking about a week ago, I believe.
And identity, they actually don't really know what their problem is. Like, they might know that something's a little bit off with their business, but they can't quite put a finger on it. I have two theories about businesses and identity crises. The first is that whether they realize it or not, they're probably going through one right now. The second is that even if they are, it can be the best thing that ever happened to them. So what do we do when we rebrand? Well, we start by having the company ask themselves a series of questions. Questions like, who are we? And what do we stand for? What is it that makes us unique? Who do we need to be talking to? And what do we need to say?
So when we're talking about identity, and we mentioned interviews before, one of the best ways we get at doing research and figuring out people's identities and helping them like express what their identity is by asking them the kinds of questions that we see for these first two. So who are you and what do you stand for? Basically asking questions to get people to talk about that. Or what is it that makes you unique? So you might not ask that direct question, especially if you're talking to, say, an adolescent. But if it might be like a final follow-up question. So you've asked a bunch of questions, you feel like you have a good sense of what makes that person unique, then you might ask that as like the final follow-up to make sure that you haven't missed something or are interpreting what they're saying differently. So that's how you might do a qualitative interview, is with questions similar to that. So sorry, a little bit tangent about research methods again there, but relevant to understand like where it is, how we get this kind of data when we're doing interviews. It's different than an interview you might see with a celebrity doing a press tour or something like that.
Talking to, and what do we need to say? Companies who rebrand and go about it the right way come out stronger and more successful on the other side. Think about Target, when they had their impressive rebirth, if you will. They asked themselves those same kinds of questions, right? And dialed into exactly who they wanted to be. And then they just focused everything on communicating that clearly and effectively. My big problem with the term midlife crisis is that it's communicating the wrong thing. And as a result, it is a conversation ender, like every time it's used, which sucks, because it should be a conversation starter. So how did we get here? Well, the term was coined in 1965 by a psychoanalyst who was obsessed with creative geniuses, like these guys. And he was specifically obsessed with why so many of them seem to flame out creatively, really young, sometimes before they were even 30, which is crazy because that's not what midlife crisis means at all now. You know, it's very possible that this term is just a misnomer, which is an inaccurate or inappropriate name. But hey, lots of things are misnomers. Chinese checkers are not checkers. They're also not from China. Koala bears are not bears. Coconuts are not nuts. French fries are from Belgium. French horns are from Germany. But these terms, they stick. We get used to them, and the literal meaning of these words tends to fall away most of the time. And if there's no problem, it's not causing any distress, then there's really no point in changing them. I mean, we don't need to rebrand French fries, right? But what about killer whales? Aha! There's a misnomer that's actually doing some harm. First, they're not whales. Second, they're one of the gentlest of all sea creatures, but the negativity in their name has created a stigma, which is perpetuating all kinds of negative feeling towards them. These guys, I would love to help. But later. Right now, I want to help us. Those of us who've been similarly stigmatized with this awful midlife crisis term. Or more importantly, those of us who occasionally experience a dip in our satisfaction with our lives and self-confidence. Because I know a lot of people like that. But interestingly, I kind of feel like I know more millennials that fit that description than people around my own age, right? But that's the thing about this kind of dip. I mean, it happens to teenagers, when psychology will label that an identity crisis. It happens to 46-year-olds, it happens to 66-year-olds, it happens to 27-year-olds. Remember when I said that the term was coined in 1965? Well, it didn't start being used by people really until later, about 1980, after a respected Yale psychologist named Daniel Levinson used it in his book, The Seasons of a Man's Life, which was a groundbreaking treatise on the different life phases that we go through as humans and the dips that accompany each of those phases. But here's the thing, it's not just humans. A 2012 study on hundreds of great apes found that they experience these life dips too. So it's a natural expected phenomenon, not just a factor of our crazy lives and our environment, but probably of our biology. My question is, why does it have to be a crisis? I mean, we know what a crisis is, right? Does this have to be so extreme? I mean, look, we're all different, right? We're unique, every one of us. The dips that we experience are going to be different too. For some people, maybe it's just a phase where perhaps you're a little bit more reflective than normal, but otherwise fairly normal. Some people do go off the rails, as noted, but most people, of course, are going to fall somewhere in between. Okay, one last thing that nearly every study in this area has shown is that this kind of dip ends. Assuming there's no mental illness present, the dip eventually corrects itself, and a person's life satisfaction and self-confidence is almost always higher on the other side of this dip. So for that reason, most of the people in the scientific world are starting to think about these dips as more of a wave, which makes sense, because that's what our lives are. We sail across these oceans of waves, right? There's highs, there's dips. Some are bigger than others, and at any point, we are just on the trajectory of a wave. Look, maybe when we are in a dip, that's a good time for us to ask ourselves a series of questions. Questions like, who are we? And what do we stand for? Can we embrace what makes us unique? And maybe most importantly, who do we need to be talking to? And what do we need to say to them? Because now I'm developing a couple of theories about people. The first is that whether you realize it or not, you could be going through a midlife crisis right now. The second is that even if you are, it could be the best thing that ever happened to you. Killer whales are not whales. They're dolphins. Your funny bone is not a bone, it's a nerve. A midlife crisis is not a reason to end a conversation. It's a reason to start one.
So I like the examples given through that video of different aspects of the definitions and how we use it, how it's changed over time. Also the examples of developing an identity over time. So hopefully one of the big things I hope you take out of this class in the end is a lot of things kind of displayed in this video. So one, that identity and change happens over the course of the lifespan. So I mentioned this the very first day of class. I mentioned it all the time. So I do hope you take that with you, that things like identity, who you are, who you feel you are, the things that are important to you, that are meaningful to you, they can have change. They might be stable over all of adulthood, but they might be different for you every couple of years. So with this, there's a lot of individual variation, there's a lot of change, and I think that's an exciting piece of research. It does make it difficult when there is so much change to find things that are necessarily stable, to be predictive of other people's behavior, but that's a problem for us researchers to work on. So with this, I want to talk about a different approach rather than thinking about this as a midlife crisis or an identity crisis. As more just understanding that this is an aspect of developing and living. and thriving. So this is the contemporary life events approach. So basically, life events will influence a person's development, and it will depend on these kinds of things. What is the life event? What are some mediating variables? What is the socio-historical situation they're in? How might they be able to adapt to it? Do they have specific skills? And what is their life stage? So mediating factors might be something like, let's say a life event is you've just been in a car accident. So you might have lost the use of a limb. So what are some mediating factors? Do you have friends that might also not have use of limbs that you could rely on and give you advice and tips and help? What about the socio-historical context? Do you live in an area that might be accessible to you if you have to be in a wheelchair or be using crutches or a brace or something like that? Is there do you live in a space where things are better or worse for you in that kind of way? Also, the other aspects of the socio-historical context. How are people going to understand these changes that have happened to you? So some of these, like say an accident or birth of a child, don't necessarily have negative stigma, but other aspects of identity and changes that are happening over time might have negative stigma against them. So that might be a challenge. So all these different aspects of life, all these other contexts are going to affect how you can adapt to whatever that change is. So change is just happening is one of the big keys of this lifespan development. While some things might on average be kind of stable, some things might change. So with this, these approaches should sound really familiar to you with the environmental systems approaches. So this is again Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems model. We have an individual moving through time. They have their own individual things, so their own age, their own sex, their own health factors. They're in a microsystem. They interact with family or maybe school or friends, maybe a religious community, maybe a workplace. So that is within an exosystem. So the economic systems, the government of an area, the laws, the political systems. And then that's it within a macro system, the norms and values of a culture. So these other aspects of the context might affect how this individual develops. So another view of this, so the learner's bioecological I think I just mixed up Bronfenbrenner's and Lerner's, but that's okay. We've seen it enough times, hopefully you understand this individual. So here we're not talking about a child anymore, but a lot of these aspects are still relevant. So the middle adult has a personality, they have a temperament, they have certain cognitive factors. So you've learned a lot about the development of their cognitive capacities, the changes that are happening in the brain neurologically. They have their specific developmental level. Now they're a middle adult. So what is their social network life? What about their parents? That example in that video, one of their parents died. So they lost one of these bidirectional connections. Maybe I'm not sure if they had their other parent, or if now they don't have this circle of influence in the same way. There's still that community, society, culture. So with this, there is a lot of change. There's a lot of these developmental cascades. We might go through a low point or a challenge, but generally, on average, most people have an upward trajectory of their well-being over time. So you can kind of expect that and hope for that as well, especially if you're in kind of a challenging time as well. So with this, there are criticisms of this approach. This is more the approach that I take, the systems approach, a focus on change. That being said, when you're looking and trying to focus on change, it can be harder to recognize stability. If you have a measure built to see change, it can be harder to find stability if it exists. So that's kind of a measurement problem as well there. We're working on making better measures that can both see the stability over time as well as changes over time. So it's way more complex than I would want to discuss right here. Basically just a lot better things like surveys or interviews, like changing things around in ways that we can make sure we're getting any stable pieces and seeing any change that exists. So basically doing multiple methods, testing it in different communities, testing it with different ages, across different cultures to see, hey, does it capture any stable bits? Does it change when it's supposed to change? Basically doing a lot more validity studies, which I think is really good. In the past, a lot of measures didn't have enough validity studies done to them. Validity basically means like truth, or you're getting at the accuracy of something. So if you want to measure the identity a person has, you want to be able to see that change, or you want to be able to see that it's actually stable. And you want that to work probably across multiple cultures, multiple age groups. So another example of this is my measure of heroism I'm developing, trying to get at intended heroes, because not everybody has that chance to act heroically. But if we can see people who might, and we can be predicting that, that could be good. So same kind of thing. I want that to be used across age groups and multiple cultures. So it's going to take multiple studies to do that. All right. Kind of going off on a tangent there about methods again. Methods are on my mind a lot right now. You might be able to see. So stress and age, we'll talk more about stress when we get to late adulthood and ways to reduce stress. Some of the big things to do are to be in relationships with people, to be involved, trying to be generative, be civically engaged, work with people. So let's talk about personality traits and states. But first, let's take actually, what time is it? Sometimes I forget what time this class ends. Let's take like a 3-minute break, and then we'll talk about some personality traits and the big 5 personality factors. Hopefully you read this in your book, but we'll go over here as well. So take a couple minutes, be back at 9:34, so not very long. All right, so we are back. It might seem strange now near the end of a class to talk about personality. There's a couple reasons for that. One, hopefully now you have a good background on a lot of other aspects of development. A lot of times lay people use personality in a really broad way that doesn't actually fit the scientific definition of personality. And there's a lot of focus on personality being really stable. So I think it's really good to talk about this right after we've talked about how many aspects of life are very changeable. So Costa and McRae have essentially the biggest or most widely used personality model that exists right now. And so it's called the Big Five factors of personality. And that's because there are 5 aspects of personality. So one is openness, and each of these is on a continuum. You're either more open or you're less open. So any individual might fall somewhere along that range. If you're really high towards the openness side, you would be said to have high openness versus low openness. So there's a range there. It's a continuum. So openness means you might be imaginative versus practical, interested in variety versus having a strict routine, more independent versus more conforming. So these are some things that would correlate. So openness versus not being open. So more imaginative is more correlated with openness. So these are correlations or things that you might observe for someone who is higher on openness. Conscientiousness is the second one of the other aspects of the Big Five. So this is a lot about being careful. So being conscientious to other people, being concerned. So that's one end of the spectrum versus not being conscientious. So organized versus disorganized, careful versus careless, disciplined versus impulsive. Those are kind of the correlations at both ends of that spectrum. Agreeableness, and you might say, well, agreeableness and conscientiousness, those sound really similar, and they are very highly correlated, but they are specific personality states. Costa and McRae would call them traits. We'll talk about traits versus states. So agreeableness, this is basically, are you more trusting or suspicious? Are you more pleasant or not? Soft-hearted or helpful versus ruthless and uncooperative. So this is maybe people might get their first impression or think of you as more agreeable or less agreeable. This is different than conscientious. How concerned are you with other people? Neuroticism is emotional stability. So highly neurotic, probably more anxious or insecure or self-pitying. Not very neurotic, more calm, more secure, more self-satisfied. So again, a spectrum there. So the last one is extroversion, probably the most easily understood because I think it's one of the more often talked about. So extroversion versus introversion, sociable versus not as sociable, fun-loving versus somber, affectionate versus reserved. This is a little different than we might use extroversion versus introversion in just lay people talking about it. Extroversion is more that you would more often prefer to be maybe sociable or with bigger groups of people versus introversion would be more, you would be more preferring to have smaller groups, even if it's friends, rather than being with a lot of strangers. You might still be sociable, but want that group of people that you already know, kind of thing. So these are the spectrums of the Big Five factors of personality. We've got openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So those are the 5 biggest factors or traits in the Big Five model of personality. So any individual has some combination of these. Other models of personality that we won't actually talk about are things like the Myers-Briggs. You might have heard of that one. If you've ever, with the time we have, I think we do have some time, and I think this video does compare some other personality models, so I'll let it do that. But these 5 broad traits, one really good thing is that they are pretty broadly universal across cultures. It's one reason it's a useful model, because like we said, we're looking for things that can measure people all across the world, not just in the US, or not just middle-aged white men in the US. We want to get good measures so we can compare people across the world, see what's happening, what's changing with people across their lifespan. So let's watch this.
For many years, the field of psychology has been trying to understand all those personality traits that make you a unique and special little snowflake. Hi guys, I'm Lacey Green, and this is D News. It's called personality psychology, and it's a booming field of research you're bound to hear about in any human psych class. One of the most well-researched and respected personality models in the field is Costin McCrae's Big Five. This model evaluates how strong a person is on 5 different axes. Let's take a look-see at those traits. Trait number 1 is openness to experience. This trait describes how open or closed your thinking is. Highly open people are intellectually curious. They love art and science. Open people appreciate emotion, unusual ideas, imagination, adventure, and of course, having new experiences. People with low scores tend to have more traditional interests. They prefer familiarity over doing something new, and they don't really like change. Trait number 2 is conscientiousness. Highly conscientious people are basically those annoying overachievers who are always on top of it. They're disciplined, responsible, and good at planning ahead. A high score on conscientiousness suggests a strong ability to regulate and control your behavior. Low scores tend to be more impulsive and unorganized. Hot mess status. Trait number 3 is extroversion. People tend to think of extroversion and introversion as how outgoing you are, but it's actually about how you get your energy. High scorers, the extroverts, feel recharged and energized by going out and being around people. They like parties and chit-chatting. Low scorers or introverts feel rejuvenated and energized by spending time alone. They tend to be quieter, lower key, and more deliberate. They go to a party and they have to recover the next day. This is sometimes confused with shyness, but shyness is about comfort socializing. Introversion and extroversion are about the amount of socializing you need to do your best and to feel your best. Trait number 4 is agreeableness. Highly agreeable people are considerate, friendly, and helpful. They just wish we could all get along, guys. They make sacrifices for others, and they assume others are good people. Low scorers or highly disagreeable people are suspicious, distant, and uncooperative. They place self-interest above getting along. They don't care as much about other people's well-being, and they're less likely to help you out. Basically, they're assholes. I'm just kidding, but really. And last but not least, trait number 5 is neuroticism. This trait measures emotional stability. Highly neurotic people are more prone to negative emotions like anxiety, anger, depression. They're easily stressed out, they're reactive, and they're more likely to be frustrated in day-to-day life. Low scorers are more calm and collected. They don't really sweat the small stuff. They're emotionally stable and balanced. Now, for a long time, it was thought that these 5 traits held true across regions and cultures. We've witnessed them in action across the world, but recently, researchers found an isolated Bolivian farming community where for the first time, it doesn't seem to apply. For this community, there are only 2 major traits: socially beneficial behavior and industriousness. This makes an interesting suggestion about personality. If there are less developed areas where personality trends are different, society may play a stronger role in encouraging or discouraging the expression of personality traits than we once thought.
So this one didn't have all the aspects that I thought it did. There's another video that I usually share. Maybe it's because it's longer, or maybe it was the first video. No, those are both the same video. That talks about a couple other personality assessments and personality tests specifically. One is the Myers-Briggs. And so if you've ever heard something like, my personality type is INFJ, that's an example of a score you might get on the Myers-Briggs personality test. So there's other personality assessments that have existed over time. This is currently the most widely used, widely accepted one in psychology. Myers-Briggs is essentially defunct. Like, researchers have realized, like, it doesn't really have much predictive power. The way it's tested is not very good or valid. So essentially, it's pretty useless, which is interesting because a lot of businesses still use it. And organizations to like group people together who they think might have personality types that align well to do good work. So there's a lot of problems with those assessments. There are also problems here though, like it's that these are really broad traits. So we've got 5 categories and they're on continuum. So it's really like 10. So you're kind of on these continuums of these 10 aspects that is really broad. So it makes it hard to predict specific behaviors versus if you have more specific personality traits, it might be easier. If you could actually predict those traits, you might be able to predict specific behaviors. And that's one thing psychologists like to do. They like to look at, well, on average, this is what people are doing, so we predict that someone might act this way. So if you're this score on openness, agreeableness, and extroversion, we think it's really likely you'll go volunteer. So we can predict that about you. That's what we're trying to do. But interestingly, personality traits, aren't actually as stable across contexts as we'd like to think. It's a problem in the field of personality, and one reason personality research kind of gets absorbed into social psych research and developmental psych research. The field of personality psychology is kind of really overlapping with those two, social and developmental, because there is a lot of change. There is some stability, but there is a lot of change in, say, your openness from one situation to maybe you're more open at home versus work versus with friends. So just one simple example there. But these traits are pretty widely used and investigated and looked at for correlations. So one of the big keys about personality in middle adulthood specifically I wanted to get at before the end of class today is that people overall get better over time at interacting with other people. So it promotes more stability in their environment as they age. There might be other aspects of their context that affect that too. So if they're in a long-term job, for example, there might be a little more stability, the same kinds of people that they're acting, maybe even the same individuals that they're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. So there does seem to be a little more stability in personality across midlife, but there is the possibility of it being different across different contexts. So if someone's going to school in midlife and going to work in midlife and has a home life in midlife and another hobby, their traits might look different and be used differently across those different situations. So yeah, while we see some stability, there is still change. So with this leads us to the cumulative personality model of personality development, and it kind of emphasized that plasticity in personality, that even though we might see more stability across midlife than at other times in the lifespan, that there still is a lot of room for change and plasticity. So with that, jumping into relationships and close relationships, we talked a lot about love and the triarchic theory of love. Let's talk about sibling relationships, because we haven't really talked about that as much. So sibling relationships have a really wide range in middle adulthood. They might be really close, they might be really apathetic, or really rivalrous. So there's a wide range. For any individual, that relationship with a sibling can change throughout the lifespan, and it might generally, again, this is something that stays fairly consistent for an individual. If they and their sibling have a rivalry, even in middle adulthood, that's probably going to stay the same, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So friendships that have endured over the adult years tend to be stronger relationships or deeper relationships, or rated more highly in like the depth or satisfaction than relationships with siblings in middle adulthood. So this is one reason I like to focus more on early adult friendships than your book necessarily did, because as we get into middle adulthood, those friendships that have lasted over that course of time tend to be rated as more meaningful or important to people. So sibling relationships, though, can be those friendships too. So grandparenting might be a change towards the end of middle adulthood. So with this, it can change identity. Sometimes grandparents also in middle adulthood have to step in and take on more responsibilities. So if they have a child that has had a grandchild for them, that child might be needing to work more, and so the grandparent now has to take on more childcare responsibilities. And this is a different thing in the US, or a change that we've seen, versus in a lot of other cultures. Grandparents are more highly involved. Aunts and uncles and other community members are more highly involved in raising children. So this is kind of a change that we've seen in the US, that grandparents are more often the primary caregiver. A acquaintance of mine, their husband actually died, and then they in their trying to work and things, now the children live full-time with the grandparents, and they're working and still trying to support, and they're not able to do all the things they need with the children in their own house. But in other cultures, this isn't as different. This is kind of just still an extension of raising kids in the community. So with this, it is stressful to be a grandparent and parent children. So you might hear the joke of grandparents love to see their grandkids because then they get to send the kid home with the parents. Well, they have lower energy levels. They might have health problems. They might have physical limitations that make it more difficult to run around with a 5-year-old who wants to run through the park. So there is more health problems. It's related to higher stress and higher depression for grandparents who are the primary caregivers. So with this, another aspect of generativity is connecting your family. It often becomes more important in middle adulthood to connect the generations who might be about to leave, so your parents or your grandparents, with the generations that are coming behind you, children and grandchildren. Not everybody has this sense of feeling that purpose to do that, to connect family together, but generally families have like a couple individuals who do that. Another term for it is a kin keeper, keeping the family together. They might be the ones to organize family reunions, those kinds of things. That can be a really meaningful thing. A lot of these other things are important, and definitely read through them, definitely read through your book. But with the time that we have, I think we're going to come back to only a couple of them and then jump into chapter 15 for next time. So thank you for being here today. I'll go back to a couple of those things that we skipped at the beginning of next time, and have a great day.